Okay, great. And I think I mentioned this in another meeting, but not with this group. Cliff Mason, who's also with us from Maryland, he became the project director, was already with the project, but became the project director for this FIDIC. So congratulations, Cliff.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good. So let's talk for a minute just to kind of recenter ourselves on why we're here. And then Terry, we only have you till 12:30 Eastern. Is that correct? Yeah. So I don't usually I would do a little more engagement to begin with, but I don't want to take up any of Terry's time.
It's
She,
Jennifer, it's
what?
fine. Just go with your normal flow because
Are you sure?
I have the hour blocked off. So
Oh, you do. Okay. Okay, great. I was going to rush through. So we're so glad Terry is here. The reason that I invited her to speak with us is she worked for years on the National Center on Intensive Interventions, which looks at, academic content as well as behavior. And part of that is how you do it, and how you actually do the interventions, how you measure success. And part of that is how you make it happen, right? In the classroom, in the school, and so I thought she'd be great to talk about both evaluation and collaboration. So continuing on the topic last time, which was evaluation, but starting to get into that collaboration because we've heard from you that that is a very difficult part of what you're trying to do, right? So let me show you, I have a slide just to get us thinking about this. Um, and the purpose for this group is to come together and share questions, share learnings about math, because we have enough grantees now, SPID grantees, who have delved into, or either focused only on math or have it as one of their initiatives. And I think we're learning a lot about math now, and it's become, a little more controversial. It's getting almost as sexy as literacy out there. And so I think folks can learn a lot from each other right now and bring in resources and research. So that is our purpose. And I was kind of helping ground Terry as well, since she's our speaker today. So let's look at, so where is your main pain point is my question. And I wanted to give you some when it comes to collaboration. And I wanted to give you should see the whole thing now. I wanted to give you something to start with because, right, because it could be, I think of a lot of pain points. But here from Fullen, Michael Fullen, he was saying that, at one point we were reforming thinking about the actual instruction. And at some point we started thinking, yeah, that's important, but so is how we do this work together, right? And for a partnership to produce change, four elements need to be present: investment and participation, expectations and accountability for change at the local level, changes in teachers' practices, beliefs, and efficacy around these new practices, and authority for growth and change. So please take a minute and in the chat, if you could, you have directions here on the left, you can just say the number if you want, or you can explain a little bit more if you want to. Add that along with the state you represent and your role in the SPDIG. And I'll be quiet for a minute. And John, I have poll questions for
Yep,
you in the chat. You saw
I
that? Okay,
just
good.
saw that. Thank you.
All right, so far we have number three and number one. Number one being the investment and participation. Number 3. Two through 4. Kelly, you're like me. Whenever someone asks me a favorite, I'm like, here are 5. 5 favorites. So 2 through 4. Good. And let's give Terry a second to read through these as well. And Terry, tell me when you're ready to go, and I'll turn it over to you.
No, this is helpful. It's helpful context to hear. I think the other thing that you mentioned, Jennifer, is that
Mm,
the last session that you all met, you focused on evaluation. And since you asked me to talk about both evaluation and collaboration, I'd
mhm.
be interested to hear like what the conversation like started or kind of where you got with the evaluation stuff so that I know kind of potentially how to frame what I'm sharing.
Yeah.
Um, if
Yep.
that would be helpful to know, and then I can scan the other pieces and just know that
Yeah. I know
um
Shannon wasn't there since this is her first time. Who was there at our last conversation? Because I wasn't there. Anyone's trying to
Uh,
remember. I see the looks
I
on your
was
faces.
I was
Good.
there.
Okay.
Um, I think the general direction was or point of conversation in the last meeting was how we get our gen ed counterparts in on the collaboration because we recognize that this is not just a special ed specific issue. And a lot of us really denoted how we're really trying to get people to understand that um, gen ed content, of course, comes first. And if that's not to the degree in which it needs to be, then of course it's hard for us to move forward and supplement from there. So that's how the conversation started, pretty much.
Thank you.
And John, you were there too. Anything else you want to add from that?
No, I think Cliff summed it up pretty well.
Okay, so I'll hop in and full disclosure, I don't have a presentation or anything prepared. Jennifer, no, she texted, emailed, and called me on Friday and asked if I would be willing to jump in. So
Yes.
I'm here, and as she mentioned, like I bring a wealth of experience from my previous work at the National Center on Intensive Intervention. But previously as well, while I was at the American Institutes for Research, I was there for 8.5 years. And then about 4 years ago, I started my own business and do my own consulting practice now. And I also led the state systemic improvement plan efforts in Rhode Island, which was centered on mathematics. And so we were both the project implementers and evaluators. It was kind of a combined effort. And so I'm going to try to bring in some of what we did in Rhode Island that was really successful, both in terms of the professional development side of things as well as the evaluation kind of components, because we hit essentially everything that you all are talking about in terms of challenges. We face boots on the ground. And so I think one of the things that we did with the Rhode Island work with obviously the Rhode Island Department of Education and their Office of Student Community and Academic Supports um, was start with LEAs that had some demonstrated readiness, which I'm sure most of you are assessing readiness or figuring out who you're going to be working with, unless you're doing kind of a full statewide professional learning rollout. I think every state kind of tackles things differently, but they kind of selected some LEAs, and we were working initially with, I want to say, eight schools. It could be more. I'm trying to recall. This was many years ago. But we implemented an approach of kind of an MTSS model for professional development in mathematics. And so we included content for both general and special educators. So to hit that kind of collaborative piece, we weren't training specifically to special education. We were training all educators together. So we were looking at, what are we needing to do in terms of a high quality core instruction? So increasing mathematical dialogue, getting more concrete representational abstract models put into place, using manipulatives in base 10. We wanted to see those things in practice. Attack strategies for word problem solving that eventually it led to kind of more training and schema-based instruction as well. And then peer assisted learning strategies were some of the different elements that we got schools to uptake. And then as we were building on that strong core foundation, we were also simultaneously training special educators and interventionists and using the NCII data-based individualization process, so that they could kind of look at if this is a student with a disability, now that they're receiving this high quality instruction, what are the interventions that we can kind of tap into? How can we make sure that we're further individualizing the supports that we have for students? And then making sure that we're tracking student progress. And so through that kind of DBI training with the special educators and interventionists, they were charged with creating these case studies around students. And our professional learning model also included coaching and support for each of these different elements. And so through that case study process, they were tracking the student progress monitoring data. So similar to what we would see with progress monitoring in any academic area, they would identify what measure they were going to be using, set the goal, and then track the student progress using weekly progress monitoring. And then as the evaluation side of that, we were looking at both what was the percentage of students that were receiving case studies, right? How many of those were actually meeting their goals on a consistent basis. We also had a measure in there for educators' mindsets around mathematics. And I'm trying to think about the specific tool that we use. We adapted it from I think from a Stanford tool for the specific project, but looking at kind of educators' perspectives around mathematics education and seeing how that shifted over time. And then we were also looking at this state assessment as the kind of outcome measure. And so what we were able to do in collaboration with RIDE and their data department was figure out, they essentially looked at the statewide data and then pulled the subset of data for the schools that were participating in the project to see if there was any sort of differential impact of what was happening in the subset of schools that were participating in the SIP. So those were kind of all of the different elements. And I know that that's very high level. I'm going to pause and just see if there's questions or anything. I'm trying to get myself like reoriented into that project because it's been a little bit of time since I implemented. But if there are specific elements of professional development or anything that would be helpful.
So Terry, I'm just so you know, I'm taking a few notes as you speak so that people have a visual as well.
Yep.
I am curious, does anyone else use a case study method for this initiative or any others? Yeah, I didn't think so. Kelly, sorry, Kelly and Beth, I didn't see your faces before. No. So could you get a little more in depth into what was included in that and how you all decided to use that methodology?
Yeah, so I think because it was such an individualized model, right? We were looking at teachers implementing data-based individualization with individual kids. We needed a measure that would get down to that individualized level. And since that was part of the professional learning, we wanted to make sure that we were tracking whether or not educators were implementing that kind of process with fidelity as well. And so we basically leveraged the NCII data tools that they have. So they have a couple like intervention logs and other things for like individual case studies, but we tailored it specifically for the format in which professionals would work best. So we ended up modifying it and putting it into kind of this template in a Google form. And so they could just fill out kind of what the student was working on. And then what we ended up doing was have them track what was happening in intervention on that form. So we, as the coaches and the evaluators, could go in and look and see on this particular date, this type of adaptation was made to the intervention plan. And then here was the resulting change in the progress monitoring score, right? So like we could actually see, we called it kind of a running record, which I know has its semantic fields in the literacy
Yeah.
realm, but it was the best way that we could kind of get that language across to educators was like
Right.
we're maintaining this log of what's happening in terms of the adaptations that are occurring for this particular learner. So they might say like we changed to a one-on-one setting instead of small group, and that would be
Yeah.
some sort of adaptation that they made to the individual student's plan. And over time, what we were looking for is the corresponding progress monitoring graph to see whether or not the student was making progress toward whatever the end of year goal was that was set. And so the case studies, the coaches all had access to it. And then at the end of the year, we, as the evaluation kind of side of things, would also look at the case study students and say, you know, first and foremost, were adaptations made to the plan, right? Or was it
Yep.
just kind of a stagnant plan? Is there the corresponding data graph? What measure was being used? Was the student making progress? And kind of looking at it. And then we, in our reporting, documented the aggregate, right? So we would talk about in aggregate, this many case study students made progress toward their IEP goal or intervention goal or whatever it was. And
Yeah.
yeah,
That's
it was kind of just like looking at bringing together the full process and reporting on it and then aggregate, but it formed kind of the adaptations and changes at the individual student level, as well as how we differentiated coaching and professional learning in response to whether or not the student was making progress.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess we're gonna do this a little bit interview style. I didn't prepare you for that, sorry. So Terry and I have known each other for a long time, so that's why I feel comfortable just throwing things at her, asking her to do things because I know she can. So differentiate professional learning based on data. Great. So are you able to share the Google form or anything like that from the case study?
Let me see if I can pull it up quickly because we've also now modified it for a literacy context for the New Hampshire project. So I'm gonna
Okay.
see if we have
Yeah.
if
And
I
while
can pull
Terry
it up in Drive.
while Terry's doing that, who else has questions so far?
I'm wondering about the focus of the professional learning. Was it on the DBI process? Was it on the intervention? Was it on foundational math or
Yes.
specific things? All of it?
Yes, all. Because of, you know, if you think about kind of even the nature of the SPIDEGs and the STEPs, it was kind of a 5-year plan, right? It's kind of what they went in. And so we originally started just really heavy hitting on core instruction. But we also included special educators and interventionists in every single training so that it wasn't just one educator getting one piece of information, but that there was then consistency across. So we did a lot of kind of tier one, just number sense and basic. It was elementary, and I should have mentioned that in the very beginning. It started off elementary and then they scaled up to middle school. So we were eventually K through 8 in the work that we were doing. As the teachers became more proficient with implementing those strategies, then we brought in additional kind of training in we did PALS math with them, so peer assisted learning strategies in mathematics out of the work of the Fuchs. That was an intervention, and we kind of called it a tier 1 plus because it's not quite a tier 2 because it is class wide, but it got a little bit more of that kind of dialogue in place, more of that peer assisted learning in place. They also received training in, as I think I mentioned before, like schema-based instruction. So we leveraged like Dr. Sarah Powell came out and did some trainings with them on like pirate math. It just kind of depended on the school and where they were at in terms of their implementation. Some schools were ready for more before others were. And then throughout that whole process, we were teaching them kind of this case study model and having them collect the data and set the intervention goals. So that was kind of the work that the coaches were doing with more of like the interventionists and special educators. We also worked a lot on the specific progress monitoring measures that they were using, because in math, we know that one, we don't have quite as many as we have in literacy, but also there's just a feeling of those technology-based ones don't always give us rich information that we can use the data. So we wanted to be able to use measures or have teachers understand why it's important to also look at how the student is performing the steps of mathematics to help us then do an error analysis, right? And so we got down to literally the basics using Monitoring Basic Skills program. And that's one, if you're not familiar with it, again, out of the Fuchs work in Vanderbilt, pretty reasonably priced in terms of a progress monitoring measure. Some of the other places we're using like Star Math. That was a big one in Rhode Island at one point. I don't know that they're still using Star. And then we know that there's other progress monitoring tools, but those were kind of the things that we were focused on. Holistically looking at tier one practice, then as we built that foundation, how do we bring in some of those other elements? Oh, we also trained them in number talks. We did a lot of training in number talks at the tier one level. And I did find the case study. I am going to say that there are comments in it because I was like, oh, this is how we might adapt it for the New Hampshire project. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see what it looks like. And it's by no means a polished product. It's just what worked for us. And I can see if I can make it a little bit bigger because it's probably pretty small down there for you. And close the comments pane, and then maybe we can just see what's here. I don't know why it's cutting off. I wish I could get rid of this comments pane. I wonder if I can. I don't know. Either way, what we were having them do was kind of look at what was going on. So this part, we had them look at the screening data from their universal mathematics screener that they were already implementing. I will say, and this is something that came up time and time again and has come up in other conversations around evaluation, different schools were using different screeners and different schools were using different progress monitoring measures. And so when we put the aggregate, we just talked about, regardless of the tool, how many of the students were at whatever cut point, right? So were they at well below meets proficiency or above proficiency? That kind of threshold, whatever those cutoffs and benchmarks were from the particular tool, we just said like what was the percentage of students within that cutoff range as our reporting metric, because it was too hard to try to compare each school's measures and each measure's way of identifying a specific benchmark because we know that they're different. And so it was more just based on whatever tool they're using, where are the students at? So we just had them kind of document, what was happening in terms of screening, what they identified as the particular skill deficit, what they were already doing at tier one. So this was what the general education teacher was doing. So again, the case study was more for like the interventionist or special educator. And then what are the strengths of the student that we can build off of? This part of the plan here, or the case study, is directly tied to the training involved with National Center on Intensive Intervention, which is where we're generating a hypothesis. So they would have team meetings for the individual students, and they would say, like, what are the clarifying questions? And so they would talk about, well, is there another underlying deficit, or is there a reading related need that the student might have? Other educators were asking questions. Is there a behavioral or motivation component that needs to be addressed? And then the initial hypothesis would be around where do we really think in terms of how best to next adapt or intervene. And so the initial hypothesis could be something like, well, the underlying motivational impact is causing the student to not progress as fast in mathematics, right? Or during intervention. And so that would be the initial hypothesis. Then they would identify what are some of the evidence-based strategies that we might be able to kind of put into place. And this portion, if you know the NCII model, is done with the whole team. So it's a team of educators working, and everybody can kind of list things out, just kind of say, have you tried this? Or let's try this, or let's move forward with this. And then what you do is you rank, right? And so there's some, like number 3 down here would be, we've already attempted that. So that's not something that we need to move forward first. And then it's, we need to research this further. So sometimes that would be things like, is there an external factor? Was there maybe a change at home that we don't know about? And so that would be something that they would need to research further. And then what this list does over time is it allows them to go back and say, we already tried this, or we just made this adaptation. And then it lets them kind of have another starting point the next time they meet. So they're not always having to kind of like go back to that. And then down here was where they actually kind of came up with their plan. So this would be looking at, again, this is NCII's approach to, if you're familiar with the taxonomy of intensive or of intervention intensity by Fuchs and Malone, it has you look at the evidence-based practices or interventions that are put into place across these different domains. And so they would look at what is the intervention that we're currently implementing, how well does it address these different domains, right? And then they would be able to then kind of over time, this is that like running record down here, would be able to kind of say, we need to adapt the intervention to better focus on attention to transfer. And if you know that, that's looking at how well is the student understanding what's happening in intervention, and then being able to take what they know from intervention and apply it back within the Tier 1 general education curriculum, which in mathematics is a huge, huge, huge element. Alignment and attention to transfer, those 2 domains. And this gets to that general education, special education collaboration piece that was kind of another point that Jennifer wanted me to talk about, was really something that we found. If you look at math intervention in specific in comparison to math curriculum at the Tier 1 level, even if they're presenting the similar sorts of approaches to understanding, they're using different terms. So the student is potentially learning something different, or how to do something differently in a Tier 1 context from a Tier 2 context. And so getting all educators on the same page to say, we need to flex how we're talking about number bonds, or we need to flex how we're talking about a specific, if part whole, or whatever it is in terms of schema, helping the student to understand what I'm learning in intervention connects back into the general education curriculum. This is how I'm learning about it here. This is what it means in this setting, right? Or in this context. That was a huge realization for a lot of the educators working, was like essentially the kids were learning like 2 different math languages, because the language of the curriculum and the language of the intervention were so different. And we talk about fidelity and that piece, like if we both had fidelity to these elements, right, we're following the script here and we're following a script here, that kid is still going to leave confused. So we have to have flexibility within that model. So that was a big piece around that collaboration between gen ed and special ed, and even intervention and Tier 1, was making sure that they were looking as a team to see how is the student learning this in context and is it the same across contexts and across settings, to help them. And then we had their fidelity checks involved here. And you can see like they had their progress monitoring data, their graphs that they had that were just kind of supplemental to this plan. And then they had like their actual changes and adaptations that they were making. And then they were supposed to also identify the taxonomy dimension that was addressed. So essentially we were teaching them DBI, and we leveraged a lot of that process, but we did it in like a more organic way, I think.
And Beth had a question, Terry. How
Oh, yep.
did you capture the universe of students? Like, did every single student you all were working, to support their teachers, et cetera? Did you have a case study for that student, or was it a sample?
The case study students were just the students that were identified by the interventionist or special educator as requiring that DBI process. So the case study
So it's
was
the
not,
universe of everyone who is receiving intensive intervention, pretty much, right?
for the
Or not?
most part. I would say
Okay.
in the initial onset, we only had the educators kind of keep track of like one or two kids because they were learning the process. As time went on, they adopted the process for other kids as well. And so we ended up having kind of more case study students over
Okay.
time.
Beth, did you want to know the actual N size, or does that matter?
I was going to
That's what
say,
I
don't
wanted to
make me
know.
go back. I'd have to pull up the
Yeah.
report.
It's
No,
a
I was
memory
just
memory
curious how
test.
I'm just curious how you selected and that works.
Yeah, we kind of just talked about, I think even in the reporting process too, we would say like educators selected intervention case study students. And then of this number of case study students, this was the percentage of students that made growth toward their, and we actually, I think we called it made ambitious growth. So not just,
Mm.
and that would have been how the progress monitoring measure was codifying ambitious growth, right? Based on the student's rate of improvement.
Harry, I'm wondering about the practical aspects of implementation. Like, was there any challenge related to getting people together and use of time for the collaboration that's needed?
It was sort of an expectation of their participation with the grant. Or as being, like again, like thinking about were there already existing teams. So for many of them, they already had like a student support team or something. And so we would leverage that team, but kind of focus in on the case study students during that time period. There, each of the schools had a dedicated coach, and so the coaches would go and facilitate teams initially, and then they would kind of gradually release that facilitation to the site teams as well. So I think it was more about like leveraging what they already had in place and teaching them the process versus doing something new and additional beyond what they were already doing. That was probably the most successful approach. But yeah, time is always an issue in schools, we know. So and I would say that was similar to what we would do with our training and professional learning through NCII as well, was kind of talk to them about like what are the teams that you already have in place and where would this DBI process kind of naturally fit. In many cases, what we found was that there were stronger teaming happening for students at a tier 2 or tier 3 level than there was once they got an IEP. And that was a huge part that we trained on, was students with disabilities. Just because they have an IEP doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be engaging in really rich ongoing teaming. Because what happens is they're like, well, there's the IEP team that's doing that, but then the IEP is only an annual document versus DBI being an iterative, ongoing process that we're engaging in throughout the school year. And so kind of shifting that mindset, I think, is something that is incredibly important in intervention work, and making sure that they recognize that students with disabilities, our general education students first, should have access to those tiers of support and the same level of teaming that we would be doing for any kid receiving intervention.
How did you help them with that mind shift or a shift or to grow that mindset?
Yeah, I think a lot of times it was really about just helping them like come to that realization themselves. Like it kind of, well, tell me about what you're doing for MTSS. Tell me how you're, okay, this is a student with a disability. Like, tell me about their teaming process. And then they would say something like, oh, well, that they have an IEP in the IEP team. And I said, okay, so tell us how frequently the IEP team is meeting, right? About instructional changes, right? And so not just about like changes to the annual IEP and the goals, but about how to inform ongoing iterative instruction. And they would be like, we're not, and then it was like that kind of aha moment of, should we be doing that? Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that was kind of like more of the approach to helping them understand the importance of ongoing iterative teaming for students with disabilities.
So do you think that's a little bit like cognitive coaching in a way?
Yeah,
I don't
guess,
know. I'd have to look back at cognitive coaching. I've actually never done it, but just curious.
yeah, kind of like leading them there, but not necessarily telling them,
Hmm.
or,
Having them reflect on, yeah, what they think about it, I guess is a little bit different. Anyways, just a thought. Carol, what's your thought on that? I'm curious because I know you've been thinking about inclusion for a long time and working on inclusion successfully. What do you think helps to shift mindsets when it comes to, hey, this kid is now getting, covered under IDEA, getting special education services, therefore we get to shift the kid over here and not
Yeah,
worry about it again.
I think what Terry described is what happens a lot. They think they're like these two different buckets. And I think one of the things that I have seen is that schools have, whether it's a CLT or a PLC, whatever acronym they call it, they're talking more about curriculum and generalized adaptations versus interventions. And it's through, if they have a more of an intervention team, they're really looking at students who are in that intervention, which students with IEPs may or may not be.
Mhm.
So I do think that there is that gap. I love the idea of having, see, the thing is, if you think about it as an intervention team, you're thinking about kids who participate in a supplementary intervention versus kids who are receiving adapted instruction, specially designed instruction within a general framework. And it just, made me think about how important it is that they review whether it is working or whether they're blaming the kid for not being able to do XYZ.
Any other questions around? I know, I've kind of shared a lot. Yeah, go ahead, Shannon. I say your hand's up.
Yeah, Terry, I'm just curious, what is the time intensity of doing a case study model versus other evaluative models?
When you say time intensity, are you thinking in terms of the educator's data collection or your analysis of them?
Well, Beth would have to ask about the analysis. I'm just trying to think capacity on a case study, what that looks like. Again, when you have a fairly small team, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think because it's like it again, it was like really embedded into the school's practice. We would leverage their existing team meetings that they were already doing. And essentially the theory around the DBI process and the model that NCII trains people in is there's an initial kind of learning curve that happens. But if you do that, like on that case study template that you saw, like if you're looking at doing that brainstorming and then you're rating, like what are we going to try first? You should be able to get an individual student meeting done in 3 to 5 minutes. So that is the working kind of concept around it. You follow a specific agenda. And here I'll pull up because I'll just pull up NCII's website and go in and show you their intervention.
Yeah. And as you're doing that, Terry, you made me think that if you start from that, if you start with your, getting the why behind the work, and also, at first it's going to take this long, but we're working toward having it take this long, so that they can see in the future. Because I was thinking, Shannon, about your question as well. Like the cognitive load seems really great, right? And so you don't want to overwhelm people. And so it's always thinking about how you can present something that they see the use for it, but also like, I will be able to master this eventually, and then it'll be easier.
So a follow-up question on that would be, once you do this process, what is the validity check that they actually follow the process that was set forth in those meetings?
I put in the link to the NCII materials. Essentially, there's facilitator guides, there's participating guide or participant guides, there's an agenda, there's note-taking templates, there's the actual intervention plan, which is the one that we adapted for that Google form format because it kind of pulls together all of these different pieces. And then the fidelity component, there's a fidelity log that you can use for the teaming processes itself, similar to like a TIPS model, looking at, kind of the fidelity to the teaming practices. But we really emphasize fidelity to the interventions, right? So we would train them also on like the 5 elements of fidelity, making sure that they were thinking about, all of the different components, not just was the student in attendance, but there's a intervention log that NCII has that also builds into it. And I'll share my screen. This is the one I just clicked on. So they have like this weekly DBI log. But they say like in this week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, was the intervention offered? Was the student present? How long? What was the intervention duration or frequency? What was the level of engagement that the student had? And then was the intervention implemented as planned? So it's getting to those 5 elements of fidelity just in one quick little part. So it's the adherence, duration, quality of delivery, engagement, all of the different components. And then they were supposed to do this end of week evaluation. This didn't always happen, I would say, but getting them to just kind of track whether or not the intervention was implemented was kind of a step 1. And then that's one of the kind of tools that NCII has available. Click back on this other link here, but the like the agendas and stuff like that also have, kind of the process in place. And then there's the note-taking template. The other thing is like really training them to like use the checklists and things that are already developed. So they're not trying to arrive at strategies, like just blindly, I guess would be the way to think about it, so that they have like a list that they can refer back to. And NCII has the intensification strategy checklist handout that maps back to the taxonomy dimensions. So if they were saying that this is potentially an issue related to attention to transfer, there were ideas related to how do you address attention to transfer. But Shannon, I'm not sure if that answers the specific question.
No, all of that's very helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, literally teams were able to get these down to like I said, like 5 minutes per meeting. So they could have like an hour long, and then they could literally do a teaming for multiple students. Because I think one of the biggest things that we got them to shift from a traditional sort of student support model that I've seen in practice is focusing on the problems to a more solutions oriented, and really truly using the data to say, you know, we need to adjust the needle here, and get them to move forward. And I was looking at Kelly was looking at your comment. Yeah, even within an MTSS context, we, because like right now, I mentioned I do the external evaluation for New Hampshire SPIDIG, which is focused on literacy, but it's through an MTSS model. And so they have leadership team meetings. And so we have, you know, fidelity to their leadership teaming practices is something that we're looking at. But we also kind of look at, you know, having them build out their own student case studies, but you can look at tier 2 intervention data and then tier 3. So kind of following that same approach of, are we looking at school-wide data and grade level data at that tier 1 level? Are we looking at class-wide data and group level data, right, at that tier 2 level? And then tier 3 is more that individual student. Those are elements that in the New Hampshire work we've built into their annual needs assessment process for them to think about.
You've got us all really thinking, which is great. This is what we needed. I love it because, and it was interesting because, you know, my last minute call to Terry, I'd been thinking this would be more just like breakout discussions today and things like that. But I felt like we needed something a little more concrete to move from. And when I think concrete, I think Terry Marks. And so she was the original person who would give a give a presentation using a slide deck, and then she'd give a one-page infographic summary on what she presented. And I was like, this is so cool. It makes it concrete. You can walk away with it. So I love it because collaboration in this instance it is amorphous, right? Like our collaboration is about, okay, that could mean so many things. But bringing people together on a single tool, there might be lots of tools feeding into it, but in the end, it's a single tool that you can then analyze and have infographics from, et cetera, and aggregate. But I love that that is a way to say, like, well, we need a team to do this, right? Like we've got to come together. This is the specific thing that we're accomplishing together, even though it includes many elements in it. Do you think that's an appropriate way of saying it, Terry?
Yeah, and as I'm reflecting, I think one of the other pieces, and I think this is potentially something that you all will find in the work that you're doing in terms of collaboration across general and special education in the math realm in particular, and especially as your state and locals may be in different places adopting high quality materials, right? Either curriculum or instructional materials. Is that general educators actually have a stronger knowledge base than special educators in terms of the math practice. And so figuring out how do we jointly train so that everybody is learning the same strategies and speaking the same language. I mean, if you think about when Rhode Island was doing this work, it was 10 years ago. I think they started it started in 2020 or in 2016. So that math project started in 2016. And if you think about now, we're just emerging in the field as having these conversations around perhaps we need to do quote unquote, the science of math. And kind of get that same sort of approach of like science of reading implemented. I think Rhode Island is a really nice example of a state that saw the need in mathematics, did not necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of literacy. So they had their SIP focused on math, and they had then they were awarded a SPDIG to focus on literacy. And they already had a strong behavioral kind of element in the state from previous SPDIGs. So that example of like building the capacity to do all of the things across the content, but really everything was framed around their MTSS model. But I think like you may find, and if you are digging into middle school and high school, that your special educators actually do not have the same level of content knowledge as the general educators in the mathematics. And so making sure that they are co-trained in the curriculum and in how to break down the math in more meaningful ways is incredibly important. And they're going to need training and, you know, specific interventions and those types of things. Like I recently was in a classroom, and this is not in Rhode Island, this is not even in New Hampshire, it's a different state that I've been doing work with. And the special education teacher, you could tell, did not have a strong math background and was teaching the kids how to use the Desmos calculator as a cheat on the SAT. Okay.
Oh,
Like that was verbatim the language that I heard coming out of that special educator's mouth. And that makes me pause, because we want kids to understand the underlying foundation of the math and what's going on before just teaching them how to use a tool, right? They need to do both. So just things to kind of think about is like, if you're implementing a new curriculum, the general education teacher and the special education teacher should both be trained, right? Because if we're stating that a special educator needs to be able to support standards-based grade level aligned instruction, they need to have a strong understanding of what that looks like and the progression of the skills. So that's something else I would really highlight in terms of, you know, we tried as much as possible to train, co-train special education and general education together.
absolutely. Right. So I think we're pretty much at the end of our time. I would ask for another question, but we've been getting into deep stuff that takes a little bit of time, more than 4 minutes probably. So Terry, this has been so fantastic having you join us. Thank you for doing it for us.
Yeah,
Can
absolutely.
you share, you able to share anything with the case study where people could actually, I mean, I know you shared it on your screen, but is there any like a link or anything that's publicly accessible or a version?
Let me see if I can get the other one that doesn't have my comments on it.
You don't have to do it now either. Just at some point, if you're able to share it, I can send it out to everyone. And the whole main group unfortunately couldn't make it today. They ended up having a required meeting. So others will be able to listen to the recording and use that as well.
Here's a link to a copy of one that we had from, looks like it's from 2019. It might even have a little bit more in there. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, this looks to be the same.
Okay.
But I would just encourage you to make a copy of it, and then, you know, feel free to adapt or anything rather than typing into it specifically or making changes. Yeah,
let's do that.
It's not set up to like make a copy automatically, but go ahead and make a copy. And AIR still has it was at least, I don't know if they're still supporting, but they were still supporting the state with their state systemic improvement plan in math, and we're expanding the work to additional LEAs in the state. So
interesting. Okay. we'll keep that in mind as well. All right. Well, it has been a pleasure to have everyone together. Um, we we need to decide for our next meeting if we want to continue the conversation about collaboration or if we want to get into one of the other challenges in math. Or so one of the other topic areas that was brought up was integrating evidence-based practices in math into things that are already existing. Oh, and thank you, Terry, for that. So why don't you, everyone, think about what you would like to talk about next when John sends out the recording and notes, etc., from today. We'll give you a chance to respond directly to that email with what you'd like to talk about in 2 months, right? John, we're meeting again in 2 months. You're muted, John. Just
Thank you for that. I was boiling
uh,
the ocean with what I had to say. No,
yeah.
not exactly correct. I have to do the math in my head. The next meeting is actually October 12th.
Okay, so we're doing quarterly now. Good.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we meant
Now,
to do.
one
So,
wrinkle with that is I think people, myself included, may be traveling to DC on that day for the national
oh
meeting on the
yes.
14th.
Okay. So a good idea to change that. Good heads
Yeah.
up.
So
Okay.
we'll follow up, Jennifer, you and I will talk about
Yeah.
that. We'll follow up and I'll send out an updated meeting invitation to people.
Great, great. Thank you again, Terry, and we look forward to working with you in the future. And of course, we'll see you in SIG Network events as the evaluator for New Hampshire. And thank you everyone else for joining, and we will be communicating with you via email.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Okay, have a good day.